Joining us now, you know how we have these young people on now, these wonderful young writers we're having on from Young Voices. The organization is called. I don't get. I've got to talk to them and find out why they and how they manage to do this. They find these brilliant young people and then push them out our way so they can promote their work. So joining us is a new one of those right now. Neetu Arnold is her name, and it's a story on Philly schools that may not be following the research on school safety. So Neetu Arnold joins us now on WTIC. Hi there. Thank you for joining us.
Hi, Todd. Thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
Did I say things correctly there about Young Voices and all that? Did I blunder at all?
No, not at all. I think you got it exactly right. We are an organization that promotes young writers, and I'm very happy to be associated with the organization. I had a great opportunity through the Social Mobility Fellowship to really take a deep dive into Philadelphia schools and see if they're actually following what the research tells them.
And what prompted you to be thinking about this?
Well, I was interested because it was actually at the heels of New York City schools adopting phonics. This was after the looking at the reading and math scores across the country, and it turned out that many states in the South were actually seeing increases in reading scores, whereas the rest of the country scores decreased. And that prompted New York City to adopt phonics education, which is interesting because there are so many people that were saying that phonics education, that's how students are going to learn to read. And it was based on research that already existed, but unfortunately phonics was politicized. And so many schools did not pursue it for a long time. And Philadephia schools was also interested in ramping up their phonics education. So it just got, I was curious, what kinds of evidence are schools using to justify certain interventions? And I actually learned that in Philadelphia, we have a relatively new district superintendent, Tony Watlington, and his whole mantra has been, let's follow the research. Let's use it to address crime in our schools, to address the infrastructure. And so the district actually released a 5-year plan called Accelerate Philly. And it was released it was passed in June of 2023. And it addresses a lot of different issues, from crime to student behavior, to what students are learning in the classroom. And it's really well-resourced. There's so many citations when you go into that strategic plan. And so I was curious, what kind of evidence are the districts using to justify certain interventions and policies? So I just decided to go through and read some of those papers and categorize the kind of evidence that they were using.
This is fascinating because when you look closely at things that happen in government, a lot of times what you'll see is that the premise might make sense, but the execution doesn't, or vice versa, or it might have human failure, might make a great idea fail. What did you find?
Yeah, so I think you bring up a good point there, that sometimes there can be good intentions and they don't work out perfectly in real life. And I would say in this case, I thought what was interesting was that the district wanted to, well, I should say this first. I decided to focus on how the school was, or how the district was addressing school violence. It's a very big issue in Philadelphia schools. Just in the past school year, nearly 200 students were shot. 30 of those were fatal. So it's clearly a big problem for many students.
Wait a sec. Philadelphia public schools, there were 30 fatal shootings?
Yes.
And this is not the ones that we see in the news that they call a mass shooting, but sort of person-to-person violence?
Yes. I mean, obviously in the local area, we do hear about it for sure. some of this doesn't make national news, but it is a huge problem. And we have to realize that for many of the students in the district, they can't simply leave. For the families that have the money, they can take their children elsewhere. But for many students, that's not an option. And so it's so important that these schools actually are safe learning environments, that kids can actually go to school and not worry for their safety. And so one of the interesting things that I found was that the district was planning to spend $14 million on revamping the school security equipment, from the cameras to the metal detectors. And, when I first read that seemed great. It seemed like they cared about the issue, and it looked like they were doing something about it. But then I decided to look into that further. I decided to look into the research, and I even spoke to a former student of the school and of one of the schools. And she told me her experience. She went to a high school in West Philadephia, and she saw crime all the time. She saw fights and lockdowns. And she told me that the school actually spent a lot more energy on things like metal detectors than on punishing students. She wanted to see more suspensions. And I was kind of a little shocked to hear that from a student. So I decided to go and look into the research and even talked to some experts who actually do research in school safety. And it turns out that there isn't a consensus on whether investing in school security equipment actually reduces crime. Meanwhile, in the district, they've also adopted a disciplinary policy called restorative justice policies. So under restorative justice, instead of using harsh disciplinary policies, they'll use mediation and discussions to address the problem.
They talk very nicely to the troublemakers. Is that it?
That's essentially how it works. The idea is that between the victim and the perpetrator, they can somehow come to some sort of understanding. So the district...
Excuse me a sec, Neetu, because what's interesting about this is that they do this research, and it's been proven to work in the past, not in schools, but just in terms of violent areas of cities, that they have found there's a really small number of troublemakers who can ruin a community, a sizable city. Like this happened in Boston when I was doing radio there, and they had they had a protocol in place where they would have organizations with former gang members who would they'd identify the kids who were causing the problems. And it could be a small number, like 20 violent young people who could make a city untenable in certain areas. And by making personal contact with them and doing outreach to try to get them involved with things that were productive instead of things that were destructive, that they had great success. But it sounds like what you bumped into in Philadelphia was a thing that happens also in bureaucracies all the time, which is to do what is pleasant for the bureaucrats, like spending money to buy tech, and which gets you off the hook with the community and buys you a few years, but not something that's likely to be effective.
Well, that's an interesting point you bring up. And I think what's interesting here is that in the case of spending money on the technology, I'm sure that it can deter crime to a certain degree. Now,
it might, but if you don't have the staff to actually go around and check every door and make sure it's shut fully, it can create more problems very quickly and fall into disuse.
Well, yeah, exactly. And when I talked to the district about their restorative justice policies and why they have them in the first place, so they said that they prefer restorative alternatives to the harsher policies because it's an opportunity to keep those students in school rather than, they're not in school and then they can cause more problems. But then there's the other side of that equation, which they didn't really address in my questions to them on how it affects other students who haven't done anything wrong. So that was, I thought that was an interesting point of contention, and the district even tried to cite some research, but then in my own investigation on this issue, one thing they'll say is that suspensions don't actually work. It hurts students, but then I found another paper that used the district's own evidence, and they found that absences among students increased, the serious misconduct also increased, and test scores decreased.
Wait, are you talking about from restorative justice?
Just in general, more relaxed disciplinary policies.
Okay. That's interesting. So once the intensity of protocols for correcting behavior lessened, everybody got the message that we're now not being held responsible, I guess is the way it sounds. Neetu Arnold is our guest, and she's written a story that's on the Real Clear Pennsylvania.com website called Philly Schools May Not Be Following the Research on School Safety. So just give us a encapsulation of where you ended up on this. You went to investigate violence in the schools. Was that the starting point?
I decided to look at the policies addressing how the district is addressing school violence.
Okay.
Yeah.
And what you found is that they were investing in technology, equipment that would be an alarm system that would set off bells and whistles if something was breached, I guess, that wasn't supposed to be.
It's more metal detectors
okay.
and security cameras. And what I found there was that they used very weak evidence to justify that expenditure. I mean, they cited two, I would call them marketing materials, a product description and a sponsored article by the metal detector company. Mm-hmm. And then they also cited a type of study that doesn't consider causality. That's a big point in my piece, that when policymakers are relying on research, they should consider whether the research shows a cause and effect relationship with whatever intervention you're adopting, because you want to make sure that whatever program, whatever policy or intervention you adopt, that it actually works. Because it would be a shame if you spend millions of dollars, a lot of time and resources on a policy when there were so many signs that pointed.
Yeah, the evidence was there, and you just didn't bother to look. But what if it was in the hands of the State Department of Education, or if Pittsburgh had done a similar kind of thing and found out that it failed? Is there any methodology in place for existing knowledge to be shared?
I think that's a little unclear. What I do know is that the district, I know the school district of Philadephia, they have their own research office, and they usually have staffers that will look for relevant research on these topics. And I asked them if they considered cost-benefit analyses, and they never answered that question. The other thing that was interesting was that for the strategic plan specifically, they actually consulted with various K through 12 experts, nonprofits, and even some people in higher education. But there were only 3 professors that were cited that they worked with, and none of those professors really focused on research or evaluating school interventions. Now, it's not that those professors don't exist. In fact, I spoke to at least 2 of them, and I asked them if the district had ever contacted them, because they have expertise. They specialize in evaluating the outcomes of educational interventions. That would seem the most relevant to what the school district was trying to do. And they told me that nobody had ever reached out to them, both for this strategic plan and for any previous interventions. So there's clearly, I think there's a easy solution right here that the district could simply contact and work with people who have this kind of expertise.
It sounds like there needs to be more pressure on spending, though, that they view the money as easy come, easy go, and maybe the politics of the moment. If you can solve the political problem right now by doing something that isn't going to work but will appear to be a response over the short term, that people in political type positions might prefer that.
Yes, and I think when it comes to spending money on things like school security equipment, it's politically feasible because it can show the public that they're trying to do something.
There's something physical you can point at.
Yes, it's tangible.
Yes.
And I think it can get uncomfortable to think that maybe sometimes doing the right thing means we have to wait. We have to wait before we have more information to make a decision. Or if we're going to adopt an intervention, I think the district could actually say that, yes, this is an experiment. We think we want to talk to parents about this and make sure that everybody is on the same page, but that this is research and we're going to keep everybody informed about the data and what we get. And if this works, we're going to continue. And if it doesn't, then we have to do something else.
Yeah.
But because there can be some value in collecting data, and sometimes you're not going to know what the right thing to do is until you actually do it. But
Neetu, I've got to hold you right there because I'm out of time, but it's wonderful what you found out, and you explained it really clearly, and I appreciate it. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
Neetu Arnold is a social mobility fellow with Young Voices. You can find her on Twitter. We're going to break for news. Stay with us on WTIC.